All right, welcome everybody. Well, today we're going to be talking about the third of three lectures for this King Leopold's Ghost Part 2. This one's titled Weaponizing Ethnicity. And the question is, what strikes you about how the new imperialism weaponized ethnicity in order to control land and labor in Africa? Okay. And here it is. It's right above all the questions for chapters 4 through 7. And I hope you all noticed, everybody, that while there are, say, 6 questions for chapter 4, I include page numbers for most of them. And the questions go in the order in which they're mentioned in Adam Hochschild's book, so I hope they're easy to find. I don't want you to get tangled up with logistics. I want you to spend your mental energy really engaging with the material. All right, let's go to my lecture. I've already posted these slides up there, so I'm going to show you this next slide, which has a lot of words, but the only reason I show you this is when you go and check it out. This lecture will also help you answer this question in chapter 5, this question in chapter 8, these questions in chapter 8, this question in chapter 17, and in 19. So realize I'm giving you a broad introduction to this thing I'm calling the weaponizing of ethnicity to control the land and labor of colonized peoples. Hold on one second, I have to turn on the fan. All right. I got a new chair, a yoga ball chair. I love it. Right, Emma's lounged on the ground. I'm sorry, go ahead, Hannah. Sorry?
Well, I figured because I figured that you had a yoga ball because when you sat down, it bounced.
Yeah, so Emma's chilling on Emma's lounging, Hannah's chilling, and I'm bouncing on my yoga ball. All right, back to the new imperialism. So if you would take one overly simplistic view of a map of Africa before 1880s, you'd notice that there are a lot of these yellow areas are African states. In other words, places where one dominant group controlled this whole area here, and they ran their versions of churches, schools, trade, export, etc. You're going to be reading about Tipu Tib later on in the book, right? So this is an example just showing you how internal African states existed here. And the blank areas doesn't mean nobody lived there. There just wasn't one big dominant group that controlled a large area of the places that aren't yellow. You'll also notice that there's blue places and pink places. Those signify places where Europe was starting to have colonial strongholds, mostly on the coast, right? As you saw in the Industrial Revolution lecture, that's going to give Europeans more access to internal areas given their superior fire technology and medicines. And as you've already read in the first part, chapters 1 through 3, in 1885, the head of the brand new country of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, called together representatives from 14 different nations and kingdoms. And what these 14 different representatives did was to carve out the African continent and divvy it up to many of the 14 interests who were sitting at the table. Okay. However, as we discussed before, and I'll pick on Emma or Hannah, these were the representative areas who sent diplomats. Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Holland, Italy, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Ottomans, and the US. Who is not invited to decide the fate of Africa? Who's not there?
None of the African tribes.
No, African folks were invited. So it's important to realize whenever you study history or anything, who's invited to the party and who's not. So they did this, they carved up Africa. The King of Belgium personally got this huge swath of land right in the center. We're also going to be talking today as examples of the weaponizing of ethnicity and the control of land and labor. German East Africa will be an example I give. And then British Uganda, which is right here. There's many, many examples, but I'm just going to narrow it down to those two to make my point. So how did Europe do this? How did a handful of smallish European countries come to mostly control this huge continent? Of course, there wasn't like a totalitarian control whatsoever of everything about Africa's life, but by and large, these new imperial powers succeeded in doing this. How did they do it? Well, they weaponized ethnicity in order to control the land and labor of various regions in Africa. Similar process happened to an extent in Chile, which you already read about, and in India. So this is kind of a model for many colonial enterprises. Hannah, do you want to take a guess? What do I mean by weaponizing ethnicity?
Giving the locals ammunition and guns.
Yep. Yeah, basically favoring one ethnic group over another, right? And how do you favor them? You give them political positions, you pay them some of the spoils of colonial export profit, and they're your allies and they're your military allies as well. Here's one last look at different groups. This is kind of redundant, meaning I showed you another map, but these are Africa's kingdoms and empires, the big ones at least, before the Europeans came. And I show you this to get, so you all have an idea that, you know what, this big, huge continent of Africa did have its own sort of a state system, nation state system, right? And some areas did not have big groups that controlled it. So let's go down the narrower part of the funnel in order to really understand what I'm talking about when I say weaponizing ethnicity in order to control land and labor. And the example we're going to look at is German East Africa. German East Africa right here currently are the countries of Tanzania, Rwanda. Okay, right here, German East Africa. Well, how did the Germans do this? Germans did not go down there with a large number of Prussian or German soldiers and conquer East Africa. No way. What they did is they empowered a minority group, a Tutsis, who made up about 15% of the people in this area. They gave them military and political privileges that they did not give the Hutu. So the Germans empowered the Tutsi to be their enforcers over the Hutu, who are going to do what? What do you think Germans wanted the Hutu to do, Hannah?
To fight the Tutsi?
No, the Germans are friends with the Tutsi, right? They're going to team up and make the Hutu do what?
I don't know, join them?
Kind of like the Yanaconas, work. They're going to work them. Oh, I'm sorry. Delete that example from your head. So the German armed and trained the Tutsis in order to force the Hutus to work, right? And here's the German Tutsi army, right? With German-made guns brought down there. They had their own little flag. And this weaponization of ethnicity pitted one ethnic group against another. And one ethnic group was favored over another. So you might ask, geez, how did Europe come and quote unquote conquer or control all these Africans? Well, there's no such thing as an African, right? There's all these various ethno-linguistic groups, people practicing different religions and speaking different languages. And sure, there's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of differences as well. And the area we're talking about, look how diverse. Each of the little shapes represents a different ethno-linguistic speaking group. Okay. So they armed and trained the Tutsis in order to force the Hutu population, right, a much larger population numbers-wise, in order to produce cotton. So a lot like we talked about with the Opium Wars, a lot of the best lands in what became German East Africa was converted to food production, from food production, I'm sorry, to cotton plantations. And cotton was like the oil or the computer of the time. It was the hottest #1 commodity in the late 1800s in the world, right? How do you make money? The #1 way to make money in the late 1800s is, gold and silver production, but it was cotton, right? In the United States, who was the #1 producer of cotton, exported it throughout the world at this time. And so did, for a spell, German East Africa. So what do you think this is going to result in? And this is going to be very similar to what happened in India. What do you think happens when you convert a lot of the agricultural land into cotton, which you cannot eat, and you export it to another country? I see you doing the heavy metal head shake, Hannah. What's going to happen to you?
Yeah, they're gonna have a famine, and also possibly like they're gonna have a lot of money, but what good is money when you can't buy things with it if you don't have food to buy? So I guess
Economic instability.
No, you're exactly right. And again, these Hutu were given, food, a little bit of food and shelter, but they were not paid well. They were not paid a living wage by any means. So you're right. What ended up happening is a large-scale famine. So what did many Hutu do? They rebelled. They rebelled against the Germans and their Tutsi collaborators in something called the Maji Maji Rebellion. And many of the Maji Maji rebels were wiped out because, again, they literally had spears and knives and a few old-timey musket guns, and they could not withstand the onslaught of modern European weaponry. So this is what happened, right? Fast forward to after World War I, Germany lost World War I. So Britain took over control of, for a time anyway, the previous German colony, right in here, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. All right. So if you fast forward a little more to after World War II, most African nations won their independence from European colonizers after World War II. We'll talk more about that later. And that included the area that was German East Africa, Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda, right in here. This is the former German colony that won independence in 1961. Well, a tragic, tragic thing happened. The memory of colonization remained generationally within the people of this region. And what happened? Many, many Hutus, fueled by talk radio, which was full of hate and anti-Tutsi sentiment. So between April and July of 1994, the majority Hutu population, remember there were more Hutus than Tutsis, attacked the Tutsis living in Rwanda. And we've come to call it the Rwandan genocide. 1 million dead in just a 6-week period. It was incredibly horrible. It was a low-tech killing, mostly machetes that were dropped off on pallets from helicopters. 75% of all the Tutsis in Rwanda were killed, right? The other 25% fled and escaped into the Congo. And this is going to be one of the fuels that really makes the Congolese Civil War, the 1990s, all the way till today, remain very hot. This is one of the roots of the Congo Civil War today. These Tutsis fleeing into the Congo. So does that make sense how that's a legacy of the weaponization of ethnicity? Years later, the Hutus remember this and attacked the former Tutsi collaborators with the Germans. Does that make sense, Hannah? Yeah, okay. Let me give you example number 2. And King Leopold and the Belgian functionaries in the Congo are going to do the same thing. This is why I bring it up. In British Uganda, Uganda is right there, right next to Germany, East Africa. The British regime are going to do something very, very similar. Because again, the British are not sending down hundreds and thousands of British soldiers in order to control this area. They are not, right? That would be very politically unpopular in Britain, and they couldn't get away with it. Well, they just couldn't do it. They couldn't get the funds. So what happened is the British empowered the Ganda people, Ganda, that's their name, in order to control various other groups, right? These various other groups listed down here. I don't want to mess their names up too much. Bunyoros, for example, the Bunyoros and the others. So the Ganda population of what became Uganda, the country of Uganda. So Britain allied with the Gandans to control other ethnicities, and many Ganda leaders started to take on, for example, some of them converted to Christianity, just like some of the Inca kind of converted to Christianity to please and ally with the Spanish. Ganda culture was favored over other ethnicities in that area. For example, the Ganda way of dressing was kind of in these long cotton robe type things, and that became the dominant dress of the day. If you were a Ganda person, you would wear that so you could show other people in this area that you're not one of those, right, folks who are being enslaved by the Gandans and the British, for example. The national language of this colony, or the colonial official language, became Laganda, the language of the Ganda people. And many Gandans converted to Protestant Christianity. So that became the favored religion, and other native African religions were repressed, right, were persecuted at this time during the colonial era. Again, not only by British functionaries, but by their Ganda allies. Does that make sense? Okay. Similar to what we talked about in India, what we talked about over in Germany, East Africa. In this area, the land transitioned from food production to an export economy of cotton and bananas. And again, the bananas were not for local consumption. I'm sure they had a few of them, but mostly for export into the rapidly industrializing United States or elsewhere, right? Actually, probably not all the way to the US. Bananas have to be picked and then within a week get to the market, or else they go bad. So what did this cause in British Uganda? Well, same thing that happened up in German Tanzania. There was an anti-Ganda, anti-British rebellion. And you're going to read about this, and I forget what page of the book it is, but you're going to read about many rebellions. So Africans did not just sit down and allow colonists to do what they pleased, right? They rebelled whenever they could. This is a drawing depicting the Antaganda Rebellion in 1886, led by King Mwanga, and they killed 23 collaborators, and they killed all those who refused to renounce Christianity and accept the traditional African belief system. And here they are getting roasted. Well, what's the long-term legacy of this? Fast forward to 1962, after World War II, Uganda won its independence from Britain. Britain pulled out of Uganda, just like Britain pulled out of Kenya in 1963, right? And pulled out of the Sudan in 1956. However, the new nasty military dictator who took over Uganda, one of the things that united the rebellion against the British was they promised to kill all the colonial collaborators. In other words, kill all those people in this region that were seen to have helped the British Empire. And it was nasty. About 500,000 folks living in Uganda who were deemed colonial collaborators, whether they were or not, right? That's a subject of a lot of debate. But nevertheless, that's the language that they used. Dictator Idi Amin. Idi Amin, if you want to look into him, is especially nasty guy. And here he is using a modern European big old bazooka for show. So I say this, and I just want to finish with my example from the Belgian Congo. This is the same pattern in which King Leopold and his force publique, his functionaries, that's what they did in the Congo. Even though, remember, they promised, Leopold promised that the Congo Free State would end the slave trade, be very committed to humanitarian causes, committed to free trade, would invite in missionaries, philanthropists, and scientists. As you see in, I think, chapters 3 or 4, I forget which, Henry Morton Stanley was ordered to go and make treaties with various African peoples, African groups along the way, and the treaties would ensure this alliance between Africans and the Belgian Congo. And Africans did not know about this way of diplomacy, right? Treaty writing is a completely European thing to do, right? It's not a long time Africa tradition. So many African leaders were like, sure, we'll sign our name here. We don't know what that means, nor really care. So here's a rare image of the King of Cuba. Cuba is a big region in Africa. On a previous map, I showed you the Cuba area is pretty big, and you'll be reading about the Cuba people in the book. And here's a Belgian colonial governor over here on the right. And similarly, right, the Belgian colonial authorities allied with the Cuba against other local groups. And again, it was just a handful of European military officers that went over and managed this system, right? They were like the managers, not the everyday ground forces, right? They weren't the everyday like grunts in the trenches, to use a European analogy. You're going to read about one of those European mercenaries. Mercenaries meaning King Leopold paid them to go do this job, right? They're not working for the state of Belgium. Remember, this is a private enterprise run by King Leopold. So it's his private army. And here's a picture of Leon Rom. You're all going to read about Leon Rom, a rather nasty fellow. And here's members of his public force, force publique in French. These are members of his public force, probably Cuba, but they could have been from another ethnic group. And their job was to enslave and force other ethnic groups to go do the labor, And what becomes, Hannah, I'll pick on you. I know, isn't that a powerful image? Once again, this picture was taken by Christian missionaries who wanted to end this. So the caption at the bottom reads, "Native prisoners at Boma taking the air. The mortality rate among prisoners in Boma goal is enormous, the normal death rate being 50 to 70% under favorable conditions." So this is one of the reasons why we have many photographs from the Congo. There's folks who are not down with what's going on, want to take pictures of it, and then send it out, right, to America and Western Europe and elsewhere to show others like, hey, this is the reality of what's going on. And Hannah, do you remember what's the #1 export that makes King Leopold a lot of money? What becomes the #1 export? You can call a friend.
It was ivory and rubber.
Rubber. Ivory initially, right? But then so many elephants were killed that the ivory export really plummeted. So rubber became the #1 export in this area of the world, right? Scientists are not going to be able to make synthetic rubber, meaning in a laboratory, for another 50 years or so. So everything that was made of rubber, tires, machinery, were tapped from these rubber tree plants. And rubber happened naturally in South America, in Vietnam, and in this equatorial region of Africa. And if you remember, an especially nasty punishment that many rubber tappers suffered through, and their families would be kidnapped until the rubber tapper, that's somebody who slices the vine just a little bit, not to kill it, and then the sap of the tree would drip out, and then you can process that into rubber.
I thought you were gonna say they get their hands cut off.
Yes, that too, right? They'd be kidnapped, or they would get their hands cut off. Isn't that sad parts of the book? All the hands cutting off. Yeah.
This is kind of dark, but I'm kind of wondering what they did with the hands.
Oh, they smoked them in order to preserve them and to show their bosses that, hey, look at the punished one. Yeah, they would smoke them and preserve them. I'll show you next time. Yeah.
Disgusting.
Yeah, it's inhumane. So in a future lecture, I'm going to be asking this big question: how did everyday people do this to everyday people? Right? How could you do that? Right? Hannah wasn't born to cut off hands and smoke them. Right? You have to be kind of trained, and you have to be able to look at that other person as not a human. You have to dehumanize them. Right? Same thing with, Germans committing genocide against Jews and others. How do you do that? Well, you have to dehumanize them.
Yeah, just think of them as like an insect that you're squashing, and then it doesn't seem so bad.
I killed dozens of flies today in my little fly trap, right near the compost pile. I don't lose any sleep over that. No, maybe I should, because I'm taking away a food source for lizards and birds maybe, but oh, heck no. No, they got to go. Yeah, you're right. So you have to dehumanize them and see them as something that isn't you, in order to make it easier for everyday folks like this, right? And like this to commit such atrocities, right? He's got a family at home. He's sending money back. I mean, how do you do it? All for, in this case, all for rubber, right? Bicycles were the big thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Right? And rubber wheels just made a bicycle revolutionized for the comfort of a bicycle. Not to mention the future development of cars and other machinery. What was the root? How did this have long-term impact on Africa? Well, Dean Morell, one of the stars of your book, which really publishes many exposés about the horrors of what's going on in the Congo. He's the one who starts your book, right? This nerdy accountant in the port of Antwerp. He said, quote, this is from page 272 of the book. He said, the root of the evil will remain untouched till the native of the Congo becomes once more owner of his land and of the produce which it yields. So what's he saying, Hannah or Emma?
Basically, he's saying that it is not okay, and it's not going to be okay until the natives get to own all of the land and everything that comes out of the land.
And themselves.
Yeah, right? This isn't going to be fixed until, right? Because let me just get a picture. Right, when this happened, all these colonial authorities totally redistributed land use and ownership, right? No longer were they making food for export or for themselves, right? They were making cotton or other stuff for export onto the global market, not for the benefit of the locals. And the result of that, in the example we're dealing with, Congo's experienced a long civil war since the 1990s. A lot of groups are coming into this very resource-rich eastern part of the Congo. And this is going to be part of the film I'm going to be uploading to Canvas, giving you about an hour-long documentary, bringing you up to date about what's happening in eastern Congo today. And what the eastern part of the Congo has is all that rare earth minerals that we need for our fancy eye things, right, are found over here, right? It's a rich source of resources of tin and gold and coltan. all here. And many locals are fighting for access to sell it, right, on the market, whether the black market or the legit market. And I could give you examples from so many examples. The De Beers Mining Company in South Africa, right, exploited this weaponized ethnicity in order to extract a lot of diamonds from these mines in South Africa. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop now and encourage everybody who is watching this video version of it to Zoom me or email me if you have any questions about this. Let me know. Don't get too behind. Contact me and just keep at it, everybody. Keep at it. Okay, take care.